Elemental combat in video games is a fairly common mechanic that can be found across all sorts of genres. While the mechanic itself can range from a simple button press flourish to double as a problem-solving mechanic, elemental combat and interaction has woven its way into the fabric of many games. Today I'm going to be covering the elemental attack animations from The Legend of Spyro: The Eternal Night. In order to get this footage, I had to replay almost the entire game up to reaching the Celestial Temple. This gave me a chance to refamiliarize myself with the game mechanics and what I think the developers were going for. Before diving in, there's two important things I want to cover. So, much like with the melee combat, I will not be recreating the VFX, just the animations on the character model. As of making this video, I still haven't been able to properly tidy up these assets. Although replaying the game has given me, a keener eye on what some of these assets are. For example, this mesh here is all of the VFX slashes that appear whenever an ape commander attacks you. I'm pretty sure that these right here are all of Spyro's basic melee slashes. I've been able to get some of the meshes properly UV'd, but as of right now, it just isn't the highest on my to-do list. Okay, the second thing to note, I imagine that due to a time crunch, some of these attacks share the same animations. All of the basic breath attacks share the exact same animation, of which Spyro is just leaning forward with his mouth open. Depending on the element, Spyro can either run while he breathes it, or, he's restricted to a walk. And all of the basic Fury attacks obviously share the same animation, as you can see. This one is a little harder to read, as I think there's, some sort of time dilation effect taking place. It's not Dragon Time. I think it's an in-engine scripted effect. I'm going to be taking some liberties when recreating this animation regardless. Okay, that's all I have to say about this preliminary information. Let's dive into actually making them. So, for starters, the default breath attack animation is more of a default attack animation, if that makes any sense. It's very simple, it only has two main poses, and it's very short. Its duration is about 30 to 60 frames, not very long at all. His head gets really low, his mouth opens, and his wings do this bouncy little loop sequence, and his tail flickers back and forth for just a tiny bit. This is a very simple, very short animation. I think I only spent about 15 minutes recreating it in total. Now, he can walk with this animation, at least with the earth attacks, and he can run with the fire attack. So I took extra care to layer certain parts of this animation. His head and his neck are animated separately here, and you can also see my NLA editor is set up to favor this. Certain engines allow for layered animations. I know Unreal does. And I plan to export to Unreal at a certain point, so I will keep trying to build my animations with layers in mind. Right, so, for the main elemental attacks, let's just go in order. First, I'm starting with the Comet Dash ability. In this animation, Spyro rears back, and then dashes forward in a burst of flames, hence the name Comet Dash. The overall motion of this animation is more in the forward momentum in the VFX. The animation itself is really brief, and there's not a ton to cover. First, he rears up on his hind legs. Then, leading with his head, he twists forward. Next, he settles into the main pose, wherein he spins 3 times on the forward-facing axis while rocketing ahead in a burst of momentum. When he stops spinning, the in-game animation handler handles the transition from the attack animation to whatever the next input is. I sort of bounce back and forth between building the base poses and then animating this empty to give it a bit more polish. Really short animation, but very impactful whenever you see it played in engine. Okay, moving on to the ice attack, which is called, in my notes I've got it called a tail whip. I think it's called something else. This animation is incredibly simple. There's only one pose, and there are no ease in or outs compared to the earth pound. And I think I know why. This animation is more about conveying a sense of speed. The core movement is centered around this rotation here, with very little emphasis on changing poses, at all. This is probably because, if there was another main pose like in the middle of the attack, we couldn't see it. He just moves too fast. After reviewing my reference footage, I decided to start by building the core movement rather than building the poses first. So the first frame after pressing the button, to trigger the attack, Spyro immediately switches into this pose and he retains it while spinning exactly 2 times. I took this empty I have for Spyro, I set the rotation method to Euler, and tracked the exact frame that Spyro reaches 360 degrees rotation, and then I set a keyframe there. This is the rate of rotation that best matched the original game, and I think it's pretty neat. I wanted to get this one right because there's nothing else really selling this attack to me, personally. It's all about the spin, and of course the VFX. And I think that's all I have to say about the ice attack. Let's move on to the earth pound attack. Okay, so this one is a bit of a doozy. It's the longest of all the elemental attacks, but thankfully it can be broken down into a few parts. Firstly, the initial flip, the second flip, and then the recovery flip. In the first flip, the initial anticipation phase has 2 main poses, of which I could track by the position of Spyro's wings. In this animation, his head or horns moves first and carries a sense of weight and momentum throughout the attack. He slams down with his chest before immediately switching into the next pose. The second flip, like this cycle here, is a direct copy of the first flip, but the transition, like I said, into the second flip is a little different. You see, I noticed in my reference footage he immediately pops into this neutral pose. It's a little jarring, but I suppose it serves the purpose of allowing for an easier transition into the next flip. And also, while the attack is going on in-game, you're not really looking at Spyro, you're mostly juggling enemies, and you're seeing the VFX of it warp the ground and all that good stuff, so moving on. The recovery sequence is, I guess you could say it has a longer overall ease out. I think I've got that right. He settles into his next animation with a very graceful flip. Building this animation really exposed the weaknesses of my rig. I really wrestled with his spine a few times to get the right angles in certain spots. So I need to go back and update this with a more up to standard or up to code rigging practices. Anyway, I tracked the position of his wings to get a feel for when certain keyframes might have been in the original animation. I really like this last pose where he's got, his chest down, his hips are kind of tilted up, and his front paws are coming towards the ground first. I think it's very cat-like and very cute. And that's all I've got to say right now about the Earth Pound. Let's move on to the Electricity Tornado and see what we think about it. So, my approach for this animation was a little different than the last 2. Much like with the basic breath attack, the player can hold down the button and Spyro will do this, electric tornado spin attack for as long as the button is held down or until Spyro runs out of mana or magic. I decided to approach this attack by building 2 separate animations. Firstly being the sequence where the player presses the attack button, and the second which is the actual spin. I decided to not animate a transition out since, from looking at my footage, it looks like the in-game animation handler ends the animation manually. So Spyro always stops spinning and lands in the exact same direction as either his previous forward vector or the most recently inputted player direction. And when I review this footage in Unreal, it looks very silly and it looks way fast, but it has a point, it has a purpose. That transition is good there for a good reason. Okay, very last is the Fury attack animation. I say maybe the least because there's not much going on. There's only about, I'd say 3 poses and a lot of long stretches between them. Some of my reference footage here looks a little silly, and I will tell you why. There's this little, the game is programmed in such a way that Spyro's head will always point towards the closest enemy, if an enemy is in the area, and the enemy is close enough to activate this code. this is a creative decision on the developer's part, but this code is still active during the Fury animation, which means he's always kind of just awkwardly making eye contact. So that is all the attack animations I'm covering today. This was a fun little exercise. I enjoyed rebuilding these. A lot of these animations are just 2 to 3 poses looped or repeated, and I think it makes sense, you know, given the scale and the length of the game and how they had to temper their ambitions with it. As is my custom now. If it made sense, I would, you know, kind of graft some of these animations onto my Cinder model. Oddly enough, I think these animations look a little better on her than some of the others I've tried, but that's subjective, of course. It's just fun to see her move. So yeah, that's all from me for now. Spyro stuff has been pretty slow as of late, but it should pick back up soon. Freelance is kind of consuming all of my time right now. Thank you for watching, thank you for your time, and I hope you have an awesome day. Bye-bye!